He didn't say much, wore a stained apron, rolled sleeves, and moved through the kitchen like he'd been there forever. His knife work was surgical, his timing flawless. The morning regulars thought he was just another guy working the dishes for coffee money, until an army vet caught sight of the scar on his neck during the breakfast rush and froze. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was a mark you don't just get, you survive it. And when the veteran asked where he served, the entire diner went quiet because the answer didn't come with words, just a place name, a year. And suddenly, no one was joking anymore. Welcome to The Last Witness. Before we begin this story of silence, skill, and forgotten honor, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this need to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. The diner opened at 5 a.m., but Frank was always there by 4:30. Same routine every morning for the past 8 years. Unlock the back door with a key that hung on a shoelace around his wrist. Turn on the grills, start the coffee, prep the stations. He never said much to anyone, just nodded to Maria, the head waitress, when she arrived at 5:45. Morning, Frank. Morning. That was it. He worked the dish pit and prep station, kept to himself, never took breaks with the others. Ate his lunch standing over the sink, usually just a sandwich he'd brought from home in a brown paper bag. The regulars barely noticed him, just another face behind the steel counters, another set of hands keeping the place running. But Frank wasn't just anyone. He wore the same clothes every day, black jeans, white t-shirt, and a faded green apron tied tight around his waist. His sleeves were always rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms lined with old scars and hands that moved with surgical precision. When he diced onions, the cuts were perfect. When he cleaned plates, nothing was left behind. Everything he did was measured, controlled, efficient. Most people didn't notice the scar on his neck. It was thin, pale, running from his left ear toward his collarbone like a line drawn by someone who knew exactly where to cut. Frank kept his hair longer in the back, wore his collar up when he could, but sometimes, when the kitchen got hot and he bent over the dish machine, you could see it clearly. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The breakfast rush was building. Truckers, construction workers, retirees with their newspapers, and bottomless coffee. Frank worked the dish station with his usual quiet rhythm, steam rising from the industrial washer, plates clattering in steady percussion. Marcus Johnson sat at the counter, third stool from the register. He came in twice a week, always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee. He was young, maybe 28, with a kind of posture that said military even in civilian clothes. Clean haircut, watchful eyes, hands that never quite relaxed. Marcus had been back from Afghanistan for 2 years, but the war followed him home in the form of sleepless nights and hypervigilance that made him scan every room he entered. The diner felt safe, familiar faces, predictable rhythms, no surprises. He was halfway through his eggs when he heard it, the sound of a knife hitting a cutting board in the kitchen. Not random chopping like most cooks. This was different, precise, rhythmic, professional. Marcus looked up from his plate, glanced toward the pass-through window where he could see Frank prepping vegetables. The old man's knife work was flawless, every cut identical, every motion economical. The kind of technique you learned in advanced training, not culinary school. Marcus watched more closely. Frank moved through the kitchen like he owned it, but not with arrogance, with awareness. He knew where everyone was without looking. He anticipated needs before they were voiced. He worked with the efficiency of someone trained to waste nothing. That's when Marcus caught sight of the scar. Frank had bent forward to grab something from a low shelf, and his collar pulled away from his neck. The scar was unmistakable, a thin surgical line that ran from his ear toward his collarbone. Marcus had seen scars like that before. Hell, he had one himself, hidden under his shirt. But this one was different. Older, deeper, the kind that came from something more than an IED or shrapnel. Marcus pushed his plate away, left money on the counter, and walked around to the kitchen entrance. Frank looked up from the prep station, hands still moving, knife never stopping. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly. "That scar on your neck, that's not from an accident, is it?" Frank's knife paused for half a second. He looked at Marcus, really looked, taking in the posture, the eyes, the way the young man held himself. "No," Frank said simply, "it's not." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Where'd you serve?" Frank set down the knife, wiped his hands on his apron. He studied Marcus for a long moment, then said just one word: Mogadishu. The kitchen went quiet around them. Maria, who'd been filling salt shakers nearby, stopped mid-motion. Even the dishwasher in the back seemed to sense something had changed. Marcus felt his breath catch. Mogadishu, 1993. Black Hawk Down. The battle that defined a generation of warriors. The one that separated the operators from everyone else. "When?" Marcus asked. "October 3rd, Frank replied. 93. Marcus stepped back involuntarily. October 3rd, 1993. The day 18 American soldiers died in the streets of Mogadishu. The day that Delta Force and Army Rangers fought for 18 hours straight, surrounded, outnumbered, never giving up. "You were Delta?" Marcus whispered. Frank didn't answer directly. He just picked up his knife again, continued prepping vegetables. But the silence was answer enough. Marcus stood there for a moment, processing what he'd just learned. The quiet dishwasher he'd been ignoring for months wasn't just a guy working for coffee money. He was a legend, a ghost, one of the men who'd written their names in history with blood and courage in the streets of Somalia. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice barely audible, "I need to ask you something." Frank looked up again. "Why are you here?" "Why?" Marcus gestured around the small diner kitchen. "Why this?" Frank set down his knife, leaned against the prep counter. For the first time since Marcus had been coming to the diner, the old man really looked at him. "Because," Frank said quietly, "this is real. This feeds people. This matters." He picked up his knife again, went back to his vegetables. All that other stuff. It was a long time ago. Different life. Marcus wanted to ask more questions about the battle, about the scar, about what it felt like to be part of history. But something in Frank's demeanor told him the conversation was over. "Thank you," Marcus said, "for your service, for everything." Frank nodded once, didn't look up from his cutting board. Marcus returned to his stool, but everything had changed. The diner looked different now. The quiet man in the kitchen wasn't just preparing food. He was carrying decades of history, of sacrifice, of memories that would never fully heal. Word spread quietly over the following weeks. Not gossip, not drama, just quiet recognition among the regulars who'd been coming to the diner for years. The construction workers started nodding to Frank when they picked up their coffee. The truckers left bigger tips. The morning crowd grew a little more respectful, a little more aware. Frank never acknowledged the change. He still arrived at 4:30, still prepped the stations, still worked with the same quiet precision. But there was something different in the air. A weight, a reverence, an understanding that they were in the presence of someone special. One morning, about a month later, Marcus found a small object next to his coffee cup. A challenge coin, worn and scratched, bearing the Delta Force insignia. On the back, scratched in careful letters, "Still serving." Frank never said he'd left it there. Never mentioned it. Never asked if Marcus had received it. But when Marcus looked toward the kitchen, Frank caught his eye and gave the slightest nod. Some men serve their country in uniform, with medals and recognition and parades. Others serve quietly, one plate at a time, one meal at a time, one moment of dignity at a time. Frank had done both, and somehow feeding people breakfast felt just as important as everything that came before. The diner continued its rhythm. Orders called out, plates delivered, coffee poured. But underneath it all was the quiet presence of a man who'd seen the worst of humanity and chose to spend his later years doing something simple and good. He never told war stories, never raised his voice, never asked for recognition. He just showed up, did his work, and reminded everyone who was paying attention that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears an apron. Marcus never asked Frank about Mogadishu again. He didn't need to. The scar, the knife work, the quiet dignity, it all told the story better than words ever could. And every Tuesday and Friday morning, when Marcus sat at that third stool from the register, he ate his breakfast with a little more gratitude, knowing that the man preparing it had already given more than most people ever would. The diner was just a diner, but sometimes that's exactly where legends choose to make their final stand. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Frank? A veteran who never bragged, never boasted, just worked quietly and let their actions speak louder than any medal could? Share their name in the comments. Tell us their story. Let others know who they were before the silence. Because at the last witness, we believe that the most powerful stories don't shout. They simmer quietly in the background, seasoning everything around them with dignity and grace. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, subscribe, share, and help us keep these voices alive. We'll see you in the next one. And until then, if you ever see a quiet worker moving with unusual precision, watch their hands. You might be standing next to someone who changed the world, one small act at a time.